Thanks everybody for joining from all over the world. Wonderful to see all the participants. I'm being joined today by Wahde Galisgewi. I'll introduce him and he'll introduce himself in a minute. But I thought I'd just start by taking you quickly through what this webinar is about and how it relates to the executive education program that I lead called Innovation in Existing Markets. This webinar is tied to this program, and so I'm going to do a little bit of shameless promotion for the program. IEM, Innovation in Existing Markets, focuses on how to make mature products in existing competitive markets more successful. Generally, if you have a mature product in a mature market, you can innovate inside the box. You can steadily make that product better, right? Improve your current product for your current customers. You can innovate outside the box, which can often be, which is like disruptive, revolutionary innovation. I'm kind of a disruption skeptic. I think disruption is overrated. It's often expensive and it fails a lot, but there's no question that it's real and important and we should be investing in it. Kodak with the film camera, no amount of incremental improvement would have saved the film camera from digital photography. But we focus on a third type of innovation in the program, the IEM program, and that is innovating around the box. In other words, taking your existing product in existing market as given and thinking about what else can you do? What other products or services can you offer to help your customers get more value from that product and help generate more profits and growth? And so we spent 2 days on doing that. And basically, one way to think about that program is it is beyond design thinking. It's a step beyond traditional design thinking. This is a human-centered design process flow. I won't go into all the details of this, but this is one way of representing what design thinking or human-centered design processes are. And my critique of those is that often they're very focused on product-specific design, that people go out and they do this wonderful field research and using these very sophisticated techniques, and then they come back in and anything that doesn't look like a product feature gets thrown out, and you end up throwing away a lot of interesting information that could be used to generate complementary products or services or just new ideas for generating revenue, marketing those products or services. And so we focus on how you can widen the lens beyond the traditional design thinking process to incorporate more information and generate more different types of innovations that can help your existing products in your existing markets. And so that's what we talk about in IEM. What we're going to do today, though, is a different kind of broadening of that lens. That Wahde and I are both citizens of the Cherokee Nation. And Wahde, much more than me, but both of us have spent a lot of time thinking about the Cherokee culture and history and values. And in particular, some of the Cherokee ceremonial traditions have a lot in common with human-centered design processes, but I think add to it in some really interesting ways. And that's what we're going to talk about. And in particular, that a focus on learning from the Cherokees, I think, can teach us something about not how to innovate around the box, but how to innovate around the person. In other words, by focusing more broadly on the needs of a community rather than the needs of an individual, can lead to broader, more complete solutions, a more complex design process, but ultimately solutions that are much better for the community, much more deeply embedded in the community, and much harder for competitors to dislodge. And so I think we have a lot that we can learn from ancient Cherokee ceremonial traditions. And that's what we're going to talk about today. Now, I want to talk first, before we kind of dive into that, I want to talk about what we mean by community-centered design by just giving you a couple of examples. And this first one is, I think, a really fun example of what community-centered design could be. And this is the UE Boom. This was designed by a friend of mine and a guy who spoke in our IEM program named Yves Carchet. Yves was head of engineering at Logitech. And one of the products they developed was a Bluetooth speaker that they called the UE Boom. UE stands for Ultimate Ears. And it was late to market. There was lots of other Bluetooth speakers with great sound in the market from companies like JBL. And and so what do you do with a product that has slightly worse sound characteristics? If you read the ratings, the sound wasn't quite as good and it was late to market. But one thing that Logitech did that other companies did not do is they focused on the needs not of the individual, but of the community. And so I've got pictures here of a pool party and of a outdoor, gathering, and they watched groups of people use the product. And what they found was that when groups of people got together, it started small with one speaker, but then more people would show up and one speaker wasn't enough. So they would add other speakers, but could only pair one speaker to one phone. And so the music would start to change and the party would drift apart because different speakers played different songs. And so what they did was they created an app which allows the user to pair more than one UE Boom with a single music source. And in fact, if you pair two, it automatically asks you which one you want to be the right and which one you want to be the left stereo speaker. And you can continue adding, and you make 25 UE Booms, the left speaker, and another 25, the right speaker. And so they watched the crowd and they realized that they needed that. And that's a feature that really distinguished the UE Boom from other Bluetooth speakers. But another thing that Eve told me is that as they watched crowds, they ended up changing the specifications for the UE Boom, that they knew it had to be waterproof. But after watching groups of people use it, they changed that, and the written specifications said that it had to be beer and ketchup proof. So just watching how communities use it changed the specifications in that direction. Another example, and kind of a negative example, is the play pump. So this got a lot of attention about 15 years ago. And what it was a different way of pumping fresh water for developing countries. And it was a merry-go-round. And as kids played on the merry-go-round, it pumped fresh water. And they thought this was great, that Laura Bush, the ex-president's wife, Steve Case and others raised a tremendous amount of money. They installed 1,500 of these in South Africa, Mozambique, Lesotho, Malawi, and other countries. And it made just a tremendous noise in the market in the charitable market. But when it came back, the Mozambique government, it was just one of many examples, they visited 100 play pumps and found that none were working. That there was a couple of problems. They were much more difficult to maintain than traditional hand pumps, but also they didn't really think about the community values, and that many communities saw this as basically as child labor, and that the community values, even though the children may have enjoyed it, actually making this part of the community life cycle, that just day-to-day life of the community, people, when they really understood it, resisted it. So they thought about, do kids enjoy this? And yes, they do, but they didn't really think through how this would be integrated into the communities. One last example that I just can't resist. I did a deep dive into the 26,000 studies of chicken productivity. And I'm not kidding, 26,000 studies of chicken productivity, because if you can make chickens just 1% more productive in terms of their daily egg production, that can mean literally $100,000 in increased profits for some of these major chicken farms. And so they've done lots of studies of chicken productivity. And my favorite one was the super chicken study. They went into the chicken coops and they found the most productive hens, the ones that laid the most eggs. And they thought, we'll create a super chicken coop. So they brought the most productive hens together into a coop, and they thinking that they could just breed these and make super chicken coops. And what happened was disaster. they compared these super chicken coops to the most productive existing community, if you will, of chickens. It turns out that when um, uh, when chickens gather, that there is literally a pecking order. They peck their way to the top, and the ones at the top get better air, more food, and are, as a result, more productive. But they're also the most aggressive chickens. And so when you brought all these super chickens together, they basically pecked each other literally to death. Whereas the most productive existing communities that had decided their pecking order were much, much more effective. And so again, a um, a focus on a community rather than an individual is much better. I would argue with that for the most part, people are at least as intelligent and complex. Maybe the U.S. Congress is an exception to that, as a chicken coop. So what we're going to focus on today is how a focus on communities can really help us develop and launch better products. And I'm joined by joining this with Wahde Galisgewi. Wahde will introduce himself in a second, but he and I have been working on this for 2 years, I think, maybe a little more than that. The way I got to know Wahde is that the Cherokee Nation, of which we're both a part, did an online webinar during COVID on Cherokee Nation values and traditions. And Wahde presented his work about Cherokee community values. And I would characterize myself as having a typical Midwestern, downstate Illinois upbringing, but was raised by a Cherokee father. And when Wahde went through the values that he's collected from the nation's elders and captured, he explained my father to me better than anybody else ever had. And so with that, let me turn it over to you, Wahde, and just if you could introduce yourself and talk a little bit about that. And then let's dive into what you've learned about kind of the Cherokee ceremonial traditions.
So, thank you, sir. Wahde scale to Langan Awadon. On its own, the Gagian, Talipsanail. Do you Jayali latest Jadon? My name's Wahde, and as you know, we are speaking today. I can't help but feel honored to be here. It's the wisdom of our Cherokee elders that I represent. So, this isn't my thinking, but as Dave has pointed out, there are some things that he's learned from this process, and I've learned as well. And I think that, these ideas about innovation having to do with a level of community interaction is something that is very valuable, not just for Cherokee people, but for the world. And the root of that, what started us on this journey was this list of Cherokee community values, which were published by Cherokee Nation a little over a decade ago. I collected them from a specific individual, Benny Smith Jagesa. He passed away about 4 years ago, and he was an amazing individual. And then I went around and double checked everything that he was saying to make sure that this was relevant not just to one Cherokee community, but to all Cherokees. And there are dozens of these teachings. However, we decided to focus on 12 of them primarily. And so on the next page, you'll see that these 12 community values that we begin to focus on are actually tied to a traditional cycle of strategic development that we found within our historical and traditional Cherokee communities. Now, we didn't talk about it like a cycle of strategy. For us, it was a yearly cycle of planning and living. It was primarily based upon the farming calendar. Certain times of the year, we had to do certain things. We had to build, we had to prepare the gardens, we had to harvest. We also hunted and fished. And so these subsistence activities are no longer primary to our modern, relevant, contemporary lifestyle. Although, most Cherokees, I was told, no Cherokee worth his salt would go without a good corn patch. But we still meet at our ceremonial grounds and in our communities and follow this traditional calendar. The calendar is tied to our traditional values and teachings and basically allows us to digest the innovation process as a community and create a way of life that allows us to both adapt and change and progress forward in the modern world, as well as hang on to who we are with our traditional identity. On the next page, it goes a little bit into some detail about these teachings. You see they're broken into these 4 quadrants. In the fall, that was where things really took place that had to do with what we would consider renewal, which is interesting. Most people think of the springtime as a time for renewal. For us, fall was our new year. And so we would have these big meetings, both in the fall, but also in the spring. But the big fall meeting was really about understanding what we needed to do to make our lives better. We met together and we used these values to kind of help guide this process of creating a way to find consensus. So everybody's voice was heard. Agency was very valuable. In the winter, we met as families and in our communities, and we still do that. We spend a lot of time in the winter visiting and telling stories, and it helps digest some of these ideas that are brought to bear. In the spring, we activate these ideas. We revisit them again. We make sure that they're pertinent, and we try to create kind of an action plan. And then over the summer, we enact them. We make sure that this process is put on its 2 feet, and we begin to do the work that needs to be done. Sometimes we begin the process in the spring, but really by the summer is when we really activate ourselves. And we can often go into a lot of detail about these traditional teachings, and that's something that I would really like to do. But I think the easiest way to do that, I want you to look at the slide while I'm talking. The easiest way to do that is to break it kind of into columns and look at some of these values in a little bit more detail that are associated with our traditional cultural cycle. And yes, sir.
Let me jump in here, because before we dive into that, I just wanted to bring it back to design thinking and talk about this. I mean, the first thing when you first showed it to me, the thing that I thought was interesting was that it wasn't clockwise. That traditionally when we draw design thinking, it tends to be very kind of linear with some feedback loops. And when it's drawn as a cycle, it's drawn clockwise. But the stars rotate around the North Star in a counterclockwise. And so this kind of connection to nature is reflected in the way it's drawn in a very traditional Cherokee way, connected back to the way the stars rotate around the North Star. And the fall part of pruning and evolve, you'll talk about that prune and how it's not just a metaphor for pruning plants down or burying ceremonial artifacts, but also looking at ourselves. That's kind of the initial design process. Like, what do we want to do differently? And then winter is that step of really going out and thinking about it, in a deeper way, in a more atomized way among the different parts of the community, and then coming back together in the spring is really the final design process before it's launched in the summer. And so this cycle is really very similar to a traditional design cycle. So sorry, I just wanted to jump in and make that connection.
No, that's great. I think that it's important to kind of focus on what we might consider some of those Cherokee elements. Being counterclockwise, that cycle is the same way that we dance in our traditional ceremonies.
Okay.
We really, different tribes do things differently. There are over 500 tribes across the United States, more in Canada, more Central and South America, innumerable at this point. However, in North America, we have about 500 tribes. We all do things differently. But when it comes to dancing, you can either go clockwise or counterclockwise if you're dancing in a circle. And our elders say this is the natural way of things, the way that tornadoes move, the way that water goes down. Well, in the modern world, water goes down the toilets, but we even observed that, whirlpools moved in this fashion. And so this also, when we dance, it puts our heart closest to the center. The idea is that we dance with one body. And what's interesting to me, the fall, it's kind of an executive process where the fall, is reviewing, and in the winter, it's almost like we're breaking into into little groups to really get feedback. And then in the spring, we kind of have our work groups, and then the summer, where the work groups break out into specific job plans. So it's a kind of a model for innovation. It's a model for work. It's a model, I think, that has a universal applicability and exists in different ways all across the world. But this specific Cherokee way is I think really helpful for us to understand. And on the next slide, as you were going to, it kind of breaks it down a little further. So in the fall, when we're pruning, they say that really is that take it to the ground and prune ourselves. It's related to the idea of cleaning things up. And our elders say, just like the trees in the fall, we have to get rid of those things that don't serve us. And in the fall, that means that we have to be willing to step out and say, let's not do this anymore. Let's do this instead. A lot of innovation processes come with a challenge or a question as a starting point. And I think that this is where we evaluate ourselves and determine what those challenges are that we need to overcome. And there are other teachings within this, but we want to move on to some other aspects. So in the winter, we're gathering together and we have a lot of time to spend with each other, visiting. Even still today, when we work at 9-to-5 jobs, our evenings are a lot of times spent at home with the family. And one of our teachings says that, one of the ways that you find it where people are is you look for something special or unique about that person. And when in Cherokee we say Dejadag Wahde, Dejadag Wahde, and Dejadag Wahde means y'all to each other find something unique or valuable to hold in high regard. It's related to the word sacred. Wahde is our word, one of our words for sacred. It's our word to hold something in high regard. And this is how we're supposed to treat one another. And it's, we have a tendency when we meet one another to find faults. Everybody has differences. Those differences are easily apparent. This teaches us to do the opposite of that, to find something valuable. And there are other, values within this, but we'll go on to the next group. Once we're gathering together in spring, we traditionally have another meeting. And at this point, we start to think about how to motivate one another, how to work together with each other. And some of these teachings, they could have, I think it was your idea initially that these teachings, kind of fit together with certain parts of the cycle. And when you pointed that out, I was wondering how you would put them together. And that's exactly what we started to talk about. And it was intuitive. You had this understanding, probably because of your father and your upbringing, about how to tie these things together with this cycle. And the elders say the same thing. Different communities maybe put some of these teachings in slightly different places, but the idea is that they weave together and almost like spokes of a basket, and they make things stronger. So we have a couple of teachings here, but this one is an abbreviated Ulskedi Dejadayela Sesti. And Ulskedi is another way to say sacred, but it's a different kind of sacred, not necessarily elevated above our peers, but in a way that shows a unique value, a unique purpose, a unique gift that every person has. And this idea is that we find each other. We learn who one another is. We really get to know one another's likes and preferences, and we try to treat one another how people want to be treated. Not just how I myself might want to be treated, but if I know somebody, I can spend time with them and treat them the way that they want to be treated. So Ulskedi Dejadayela says tasks us with likening ourselves to that which is sacred in one another. And easy translation is treat each other as sacred. And there are a couple of different, teachings that fall in the same vein, but moving on to the next grouping, I think probably the teaching that epitomizes this is this Dejadatliya Sesti. Probably the struggle to hold on or cling to one another, no matter what. Now, if you say it different, Dejadatliya Sesti, it's talking about a physical grappling. My grandma used to say, y'all go out yonder if you want to wrestle. But this is kind of struggling intellectually, more emotionally, to hold on to those that you care about. If you really care about somebody, you'll find no reason to let go of them. You won't let anything come between you and that person. So this is that value that we hold on to one another no matter what. And through the summer months, that's when we're doing the physical labor. That's or even the intellectual or emotional labor. The idea is that these ideas, goals, objectives that we started on in the fall, just in the most abstract ways, are not only coming to fruition, but they're coming together as a result of our own work and effort. And sometimes that's challenging. And so a lot of the teachings in this quadrant really focus on how we work together.
Yeah, and this whole cycle is very much like a design thinking cycle, right? That in the fall, it's about deciding what we want to do, and then the winter, you go out. In the winter, traditionally there was you'd go out into the smaller clans or villages and really do some individual brainstorming, right? You distribute the brainstorming and try to understand, try and come up with ideas for how you do the things that the village as a whole decided it wanted to do in the fall. And then you come back together, take the best of those ideas, share them, and decide how to implement those new ways of doing things, those innovations, if you will, and then assess what worked and didn't, and start the whole cycle again. There's nothing really special about a generic design process like this. What I think is unique and interesting, though, is this at every step, this kind of exquisite focus on making sure that you're doing something together with everyone. Especially that last value that you talked about. This, occasionally people will fall behind, right? That they won't quite be along with the program, and that you should kind of wrestle with them to make sure that they, to not let go, to make sure that everybody in the community remains part of the community, and that focus on what's best not for the individuals but for the community as a whole, I think is really something that anybody involved in design and innovation should be thinking about. And so we thought we'd take that a little further, and with this history of innovation as part of the ceremonial traditions of the Cherokee Nation. How do Cherokees, people raised in that culture, how do they innovate? And are there any unique, effective innovators that we could learn from? And the one that everybody who in the Cherokee Nation knows the best is Sequoyah. And Wahde in his role in language preservation, and can talk very knowledgeably about this. Sequoyah, I was surprised to learn that the tree is named after him, that it was a German linguist who was also a botanist, who named the large trees out in California after the person who invented the Cherokee written language, the syllabary. So, Mata, talk a little bit about this design challenge, which was to design a written language for a nation.
Yes, sir. Yeah, Sequoyah, they call him the Cadmius of Cherokee language. In mythology, I guess there was one person that developed writing, and we have a more modern example of this. What was interesting is that Sequoyah did not read or write any language when he started this process. In fact, he didn't even speak English. He spoke Cherokee and a few other native languages. He was not a slow person, and he was multilingual. So he had family and friends that did speak English, and he spoke to them about really what was the most amazing thing that they had learned in their travels, further east when they were interacting with English speakers. And Sequoyah was living in our homeland in the Appalachian Mountains, and he started this process, and it took him about 12 years. And what was really amazing is that initially he tried to create a character for each word in Cherokee, and it didn't work. Too many words. So what he arrived at is a syllabary, one character for each syllable. And if you look across the very top of that chart, it looks like a capital D. He didn't know English, so he assigned the sound ah very similar to the English vowel A. Now, you see an A right there, but this is really Roman phonetics, Latin. So if you studied Spanish or Latin or any of the other Romance languages, our vowels follow that traditional Latin orthography. So the top line is A, the thing that looks like an R is an E, the thing that looks like a T is an E, that crazy looking thing is an O, and then there's an U, and finally that V is an which is a vowel for us. As you go across the lines, the vowel sounds change, but as you go down, it's the consonants that change. So the next line is ga and ka, ge, gi, go, gu, ga. The third line, ha, he, ho, hu, So this is lined out in a way where you can, easily arrive at how to put these consonant vowel syllables together, and you can map out which character represents each syllabary sound. What's amazing is that Cherokee today has quite a few accents, and we have two primary different dialects, a dialect spoken here in northeastern Oklahoma, and then a dialect with our remnant population back in North Carolina. And they are significantly different, sometimes difficult to understand. However, the way this writing system works is it skates over the differences in pronunciation, and we can write letters back and forth to one another that are completely mutually intelligible without regard to differences in dialect because the way this syllabary works.
How long does it take somebody who speaks the language but can't write it to learn how to write it?
About 12 to 13 hours, we can become very literate very quickly, and that's for somebody that doesn't read or write English. They learn how to read and write Cherokee within a day. 2 days, you could stretch it out to a week. And for those of us that are second language learners, it's even faster. We haven't calculated it, but the skills that we have from learning English, learning to read and write in English transfer over very easily to Cherokee. However, we have to get past the fact that some of them do look like English characters.
And my understanding of, my experience learning how to write English as a native English speaker is it can take years. And that's in part because the Cherokee syllabary, these words are not just phonemes. They don't just have a sound, but in many cases, they have a meaning. They're morphemes. Is that true?
Yes, sir. It's not always the case, but for a majority of these characters, in isolation or even in small clusters, we could say consistently these phonemes represent ideas that are repeated throughout the language process.
It really is a masterpiece of design, and the Cherokees used it to start publishing a newspaper, especially at a time when there was a lot of encroachment on the Cherokee Nation, the traditional Cherokee Nation in the Appalachian Mountains, by settlers, and they had to decide how they were going to organize themselves, as well as how they were going to interact with the settlers.
Indeed, when Sequoyah came over here to Indian Territory, well, it was Indian Territory then, now it's Oklahoma. It was before the removal, it was before the Trailatiers, and he was one of the old settlers. And one of the first things that he did is he worked with the folks back east to develop this newspaper to ensure that the entire world knew what was going on.
And that newspaper is still going today. It's on the web. You can download it from the App Store. And the syllabary on your computer right now, I'm saying this to every single one of the attendees at this webinar, you can install the Cherokee syllabary. It's one of the optional keyboards that you can install on your computer. So it lives today. And one of the important parts of this is that when there was the Trail of Tears, so those of you who are not familiar with this, Andrew Jackson, when he was president of the United States, decided that there shall be no natives east of the Mississippi, and made everybody from the Seminole Nation, Cherokee, Creek, Chickasaw, Choctaw, and any other nations. There was a forced removal where they had to walk or float or somehow make their way from east of the Mississippi to Indian Territory in eastern Oklahoma. And that obviously was traumatic. And not just traumatic individually. I mean, many people died. We lost about a quarter of the nation. Is that Wahde?
Yes,
Is
sir.
that true,
Yes,
Wahde?
yes,
Yeah,
sir.
and many of them not just from the travel, but also from the being penned up in stockades before the travel and the disease that spread around there. But the written syllabary helped keep alive the values that you learned, Wahde, through this very traumatic period for the nation. The Another innovator is my father, and so obviously I'm not unbiased about this, but he invented division. So right now inside your computer, there's a microprocessor that is running millions of arithmetic operations. And it turns out to be very easy to tell a computer how to do addition, how to do subtraction, how to do multiplication. The algorithms are very clear. But division was complicated because you have to guess. And computers are really supersonic morons. They don't guess well. And so he figured out this complex representation of numbers where it uses not just zeros and ones, but zeros, ones, and negative ones. And a more complex representation of the numbers lets you guess just a little bit high or a little bit low and iterate into the final solution much faster. And he invented it, this skinny Cherokee kid in the late 50s, and nobody's invented anything faster, and it's what your computer uses to do division. Um, and there is a parallel, probably I'm reaching here, about a more complex representation actually leading to a more efficient result. The 80 some characters in the syllabary was actually a much more efficient way of letting natural speakers speak the language. Um, James Robertson was also the chief engineer for one of the first reliable general purpose transistorized computers, but also created the community of people interested in computer arithmetic. And that really emerged in the 50s. The person on the left smoking a pipe, which is, by the way, another maybe an innovation that natives are less proud of tobacco. Um, with his invention, the transistorized computer, ILIAC 2, not just his, of course, but the whole team. But there was many different innovations about this. And the group, led by my father, was very much open source about it. They believed that all this knowledge should be shared by the broader community of people interested in digital computers, and so they published everything in detail. Everybody else used that to help develop their computers. In particular, IBM was working on a computer called the Stretch, and they started after Illinois. The flow of information was really one way, and that's not a criticism of IBM. That's business, and that's happened for many different types of scientific breakthroughs that happen in universities, and then go out into for-profit businesses. But if you look at the decisions that the IBM team made for the Stretch in the late 50s, they mirror exactly the decisions that made about the architecture of the ILIAC 2. And everything from how they pipelined instructions, how they architected it, and there was also a flow of people from Illinois, University of Illinois, to IBM. And I say that not because the Stretch was an influential computer. It was widely seen actually for a while within IBM as a failure. But when they came out with maybe one of the greatest products in all of the 20th century, the System 360, they realized that as successful as that was, it was based directly on the architecture and the design decisions made for the 7030. So the ILIAC, of course, was the intellectual grandfather then of the System 360. But I think that there's a community part. I think much of digital computer development was, in fact, open source, and it was part of a community of which the team at Illinois was one part. But I think that the ways that James Robertson was expressed his cultural values was in the effort he put into forming a community of people interested in computer arithmetic. The dean of the school, the former dean of the School of Engineering, Dan Atkins, talked about how important that was to my father. Dan was part of the Society of the National Society of Engineers, which is the highest honor you can get as an engineer. Another one of his students, Mary Jane Irwin, was also a member of the National Academy of Engineering. And she talked about how uh, James Robertson also expressed another value of the Cherokees, which was very equal in terms of gender roles at a time when that was unusual, especially in the sciences and engineering. That the Cherokee Nation has traditionally had a very strong role for women in the decision making. When a woman and a man pair off and get married, the man moves in with the woman's clan. Um, the kids take the name of the woman's clan as theirs, and a young boy will learn how to become a man, not from his father, but from his wife's brothers. When there was treaties to be negotiated between Washington, D.C. and the Cherokee National Government, the Cherokees would send a full delegation of all decision makers, which included men and women, and they would show up in Washington, and they would often say, "Well, where's your women?" They didn't think that the U.S. national government was serious because there was only men at the table, and so that was another way that James Robertson expressed the Cherokee values. I won't go through the rest of these. Jesse Chisholm was a Cherokee. He created the Chisholm Trail, which was a way of getting cattle from the Texas cattle country, Southeast Texas, up to the railheads, but had to go through Indian territory. And the natives didn't like a whole bunch of cattle trampling their farms. So he set up a toll road and set up a trading post on that toll road. So you could argue that he was the first one to do a multilateral trade agreement and maybe the first one to put a convenience store on a toll road in American history. Um, and uh, and one of the interesting effects that this had on the future was that later, 60 years later in the 20s, there was a small company that created Indian themed trading posts right on the Chisholm Trail. And they borrowed things actually from Northwest Indians, totem poles. They called them totem stores, as in, put your groceries in bags and tote them out of the store. Those turned out to be very popular, very successful. A few years after this, they changed their name to 7-Eleven in 1946 and are now, of course, the largest chain of convenience stores in the world. So those are, if you will, an innovation built on an idea from the Cherokee Nation. I won't go into Wilma Mankiller and in the interest of time, because I do want to come back and talk a little bit about what we should take away from this. That there was some really common elements reflected by the way these four people innovated, that they really did think about what can we do for the community, not just for the individual. How can we serve our community? There really is an exquisite focus on, for everybody, on the cultural values that Wahde talked about, on what can we do for our community. They valued and encouraged the contributions of women, and they included members of their communities in every phase of the process. Wahde, I want to stop here. What else would you add to that in terms of what these innovators had in common and how they reflected Cherokee cultural values?
Well, I think that one of the aspects that they have in common is that even though they were all leaders in their own right, every single one of them, including stories that I've heard about your dad, were always quick to pull forward their team. And I think that, that does tie into this concept of inclusion as well as incorporating, the opinions and ideas and thoughts of their community. But I think that, not only did they work as a team, they also wanted to communicate as a team. And I think that you kind of did the same thing. You could have just taken the ideas that we discussed and put them on your platform and walked out there and represented them very well, but you drug me along. And and I'm and I think that that's kind of a value that a lot of people don't think about, that really including people also has to do with giving them a platform. And that's what
You know, it's an issue. Sorry, go ahead, finish the
oh, go
thought, and
ahead.
then
That's one thing I saw that they did that you do as well.
you know, this is something that MIT is wrestling with, that the native undergraduates actually have higher standardized test scores, SAT scores, than average. They have great grades, and they have a shockingly low graduation rate because MIT is a very individualistic culture, and it can be quite hard to adjust. And MIT is thinking about that. They're not unaware of it, and they are trying to make efforts to really understand how people from a very communal culture come into a very fast-paced, individualistic culture at MIT, and how we can do better at helping them adjust. A couple of additional lessons is that you know, as we move from human-centered to community-centered, you know, we should be thinking about how can we involve people from the community. We should be humble about our ability to really understand the values that matter. And so getting somebody, and this was actually one of the innovators that we skipped over. Wilma Mankiller was one of the great chiefs of the Cherokee Nation. And she was wonderful about, you know, as she came in to really understand the values of the nation, she brought in people into her team and into her life that could really help her understand and reflect those values. And then also being humble about our ability to synthesize and capture the way that a community will evaluate and judge whether an innovation is there or not. And then really test, is this good for the community? You know, we're seeing a lot of things about social media right now where the large social media companies have done a very good job at designing things that individuals really respond well to, in the sense of that respond well is the wrong term, that are engrossing and that people use and come back again and again to, but that may not be the best thing for the community. And I think we're learning that we should be putting some more attention on the community values, not just the individual values. And a second lesson is that you should be thinking about mindset, that if you're an innovation leader, you should be thinking about how you can focus on the values of the community, not the values of individuals. And that can be hard to do. Um, but it really is up to the innovation leader to really think about how we can do that. And so, you know, how can we take these values that we've talked about and turn them into explicit values that we should think about in a product design process? You know, so just going back to the values that Wahde outlines, you know, in terms of pruning and removing, you know, in terms of removing things that aren't necessary as we move forward in our season, you know, we should ask, what would we stop doing that would improve our customers' communities? Moving around to the winter, what do we admire about our customers? How can we let them know that we admire that? How can we communicate that? And how can we, moving to the spring, how can we find more opportunities to not just visit our customers, but really find and visit and find something sacred and important about them? And then lastly, in the summer, you know, what I talked about this almost wrestling with people to make sure that we bring them along. You know, what can we do to make sure that we bring everybody along as we make an innovation happen in our companies or our communities? Why do you have any thoughts on that before I move on?
Yes, sir. I think that, when it comes to implementing this as a process, the action that really captured my attention was finding one another and visiting with one another. I think that some of this stuff is a little bit more intuitive in our natural daily lives, but one of the things that we do not do anymore is take the time to spend time with each other. When I was younger and when my grandparents were still around, people would come and stay at my grandparents' house for days, sometimes a week at a time. And my grandparents would stop what they were doing and they would visit. And at some point, the guests would start to chip in with chores or things that needed to be done, kind of as a way to informally pay back. But there was this idea of spending time together and visiting. And we don't do that anymore, especially since COVID. People really are comfortable in their homes. And even if we have to use the evil social media, instead of typing something out in a brief sentence or statement or response to a stranger that you might argue with, it may be better to use the little video camera and have some sort of a live streaming where you really communicate with the people that you care about. Even in Europe, communities were based upon this idea of you needed extended families to survive. The community needed extended families. And as time went by, the extended families were almost isolated. But even then they needed, smaller families to survive. And then it became about the nuclear family. You couldn't get by without your nuclear family, the immediate family unit. And in today's world, once kids turn a certain age, they move halfway across the United States or the world, and we see very little of each other. And I think that this idea of spending time knowing one another will help us humanize one another, and it may help alleviate some of the problems when it comes to judgment, ideological judgment, political judgment, religious judgment, when we know each other as human beings.
Thank you. I think let's cut it off. We have a couple of minutes. I'll ask you, Elaine, to make sure, but we have time for questions. So if you have a question, by all means, type it into chat. While we're there, by the way, we're incorporating this. There won't be much about this in IEM. So again, I apologize for the shameless promotion of IEM, but it's part of the deal on these webinars. But we are offering a 10% discount if you register for IEM. But with that said, and also if you're interested in getting this recording or any of the past webinar recordings, there is this. So yeah, so let's open it up for questions. Any questions? Andrew Harvey asks, how big is a community? How do other communities yeah, so how, Wahde, can you take that? Do you see that in chat?
Definitely.
I think Andrew means the Cherokee communities.
I see. Yeah. Well, at this point, we are, dealing with modernization just like the rest of the world. We don't live in our old mud huts like we used to. So we're having to redefine what it means to be a community. Historically, traditionally for us, communities were small, about 500 people, smaller than that. Even today, we have over 100 Cherokee communities scattered throughout northeastern Oklahoma in our reservation area. And they're small, 500 to 1,000 people. They're centered around churches or K through 8 school systems. That's kind of the heart of our community and has been for over 100 years. But people, again, don't get out like they used to. So people engage online or they engage in activities. Travel is so much easier. So we're starting to develop this concept of communities of interest. So I think, you do have to have kind of a population in mind. You can't have too many people or communication breaks down. However, what was once a geographical thing has now become more of a conceptual idea based around what people are interested in. So they could be community organizations, clubs. They could be specific to religions, churches, different social groups, country clubs. Those are all specific communities. So I think they could be communities of interest more so than something geographical, but they still would have to be bound within a certain number of people. We can talk about the Cherokee Nation as a community. However, it's not homogenous, and so it really breaks down when we try to explain what this one huge community thinks or feels or how we serve this community. There are things that bound us together, but I think that those things have to be defined.
Okay, I just want to Wahde. That is Cherokee for thank you. Thank you, Wahde, for making the time. Thanks for working with me on this. It's been a great pleasure. I look forward to continuing to develop it. Thank everybody who joined us. I think we have 1 or 2 minutes um, if there's any last questions. Wahde, any last comments for you before we close? Oh, Q&A. Sorry.
Yeah, there's some.
I haven't been monitoring Q&A. Elena, are there any particular questions we should look at?
As we're, kind of short on time, are there resources that we can share? I know we'll be sharing the recording, but if we have links to some of the PDFs that were shared on the PowerPoints, as well as any other books that you would recommend for folks, that seems to be a common thread for people to continue the learning.
Specifically to Cherokees, the Cherokee Nation website is full of resources. It's at Cherokee, www.cherokee.org. And there's also the Eastern Band. They're the Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians, and they both have wonderful resources.
Yeah, and we can make a set of these slides. We're still working on this, but we can make a set of these slides available. And Elaine, I'll work through you to post these so that people can get them.
Yes, we'll make sure that we can share them with folks.
Okay, great. Well, I think we're out of time, but thanks very much to everybody for joining. Wahde, thank you, and we look forward to developing this whole line of research more.